Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill, in good faith, and sometimes regular folks like me are the guest, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a second. So please remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have and you're digging what we do, tell a friend, give us a good rating, leave a review, all that good stuff. The easiest way to find us is our main site, which is www.politicsandreligion.us. And just remember, it's .us, not .com or .whatever. It's politicsandreligion.us. All of that helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today. And it's a little different what we're doing today. It's a bonus episode, and it's actually a conversation I had with my new friend, Justin Peters. Justin had me on his show, The Struggle is Real, a podcast, as Justin describes it, that is focused on adulting advice for young professionals. For those moments when you think, I wish I would have learned this in school, those are the topics that Justin and his guests love to talk about. So the conversation you're about to hear is when I was the guest. I figured listeners of this show might have heard bits and pieces of my story, but Justin does such a good job and asks some really thoughtful questions. Plus, in part of the conversation, we explore some of the things I've learned along the way about how to talk about politics and religion without killing each other. I hope you enjoy our dialogue, and I hope you'll find Justin's podcast, The Struggle is Real, and go and subscribe and rate his show too. All that good stuff. It's really a great show. So now here's Justin Peters and me on The Struggle is Real.
Corey, I'm super stoked for our conversation today. This has been a longstanding topic that I've wanted to cover on the podcast for quite some time. I feel like with this current political climate and the contentiousness that I see in my own life when discussing polarizing topics like politics and religion, I've been really wanting to explore how to have expressive yet respectful conversations around these topics. And I hope that, we'll obviously dive into some de-escalation conversations, some how to see similarities in our debates, which will pop up pretty early on, I think, in your conversation, how to change your opinion and maybe even someone else's opinion. But I thought there'd be no one better to discuss this topic with than the Jew from Jersey that became a Christian, which we will explore that label a little bit more. But Corey, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks, Justin. I really, really appreciate you doing this. It's an honor to be hanging out with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So
Likewise.
thanks for including me.
Let's start out with a man named Hal. Tell me who Hal is and what Hal did to challenge your religious views.
Hal Golden. So I was doing some business with this fellow. He really great guy, and he's probably about 15, maybe 20 years older than me. But I was in my late 20s, and I was just coming into my own from a business standpoint. I had just gotten married. We were thinking about having kids. So I was looking for mentorship. I was looking for folks that I thought were crushing it in business, that were good dads, good husbands, good in the community. So I befriended Hal and really allowed myself to be super, super teachable. I wanted to know what he knew and the things that I thought were really important. And Hal was gracious enough to give me all kinds of books and pointed me to seminars and had these tapes that I listened to all the time. It was just like how to be better at everything, better at all the things that was important to me. But one thing I noticed was he was giving me all these what I call Jesus books. So he, they were all like scripturally based. They were authors that were all Christians, and it had all this scripture referenced in the books that he was giving me. And no matter what the topic, it could have been on business, it could have been on, our country, it could have been on better marriages, being a better dad, it could have been on anything, but it was all Jesus books. And the thing about Hal is at the time, I'm observant Jew. I grew up very observantly Jewish, going to an Orthodox synagogue, observed all we were still, I was still observant. And but Hal had grown up Jewish, but he had become a Christian. So I thought Hal, having been Jewish, would have respected my boundaries, because I wasn't just Jewish. I was sort of anti-Christian. The Christians were the ones wearing crosses on their chests that swung swords and beheaded the neighbors of my grandmother, or burned down our house. And is the reason that we had to leave Cherny Ostrov in Russia, or that Christians and Jews didn't always have a cozy relationship. Let's put it that way. And even when I was growing up in the Northeast, it was, at the very least, there were tensions politically and socially. So I had these sort of cultural aspects of my DNA that were averse to what I knew about Christianity. So finally, one day I asked Hal about, I wanted to take him to task over it. I got to know him well enough. We had a real friendship. I said, "Wow, what's up with you, man? Like you were in the tribe, you were on my team and now you're on the other team. Like, what's up with you?" So he responded by giving me a book. And I knew by the title that it was another Jesus book. It was called More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. Little book. It took me about 3 hours to read it, but I knew, I called him out. I'm like, "Dude, what's up, man? Like, I'm kind of calling you out on this Christian thing. And your response is by giving me a stinking Jesus book." And he goes, "Listen, here's the thing. You know what it means to be Jewish. I know what it means to be Jewish. I know what it means to be Christian, but you don't have the first clue what it means to be a Christian. So at the very least, just be intellectually honest and read the book. At least we'll have something to talk about." So I'll read your stinking book. I read it, I didn't find it persuasive, that I could tell. It wasn't one of those things where I read it and I'm like, "Oh, epiphany. Oh, I'm going to be a Christian now." It was more like I was taken aback because I'd never read someone even try to make an empirical case for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I'm like, I am thoroughly unconvinced, but tell me more, So Hal recommended a few other books, and then I started looking on my own. Basically, what that encounter did was it opened the door. And because I had very deep convictions, philosophically, theologically, from my Jewish heritage, I was just inquisitive. I thought, man, if I'm going to explore this other possibility, I really need to be, I guess you could say, pluralistic about it. So I began looking at other world philosophies. I had intro to it, and I was always very inquisitive. I had deep existential questions that I felt the need to explore throughout my 20s, but never to this extent. In the next 6 months, 8 months, I just had this voracious reading habit. I was reading easily 6, 8, 10 hours a day. From Buddhism to Zoroastrianism to philosophical cases, philosophical debates. And it really led me down this road where finally this whole time I hadn't read the New Testament. And finally, about 6 or 8 months into it, I cracked open the book. And at that point I circled back with Hal. I'm like, Hal, a lot of the basic questions that I had, I was starting to see a coherence and just a consistency with some of the Christian theological answers from what I was reading. I was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis. I was first introduced to G.K. Chesterton and N.T. Wright, some great theologians and thinkers. And it was just becoming more coherent, basic answers to basic existential questions. But I hadn't read the New Testament. So I asked Hal, is there a place where you think I should start at the beginning, or where do you? So he told me to start in the book of James. Sorry, this is becoming a much longer story.
Go for it.
He told me to start in the book of James, which was really strategic of him because it starts with something along the lines of, to the 12 tribes, blah, 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 and the 12 tribes, that's me. I'm like, "Hey, how you doing? I'm a Jew." Like, you talking to me. And it also, that particular letter deals with some of the questions that I had that weren't lining up for me, like the faith versus works is a big theme that James explores in that book. So I read through it. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And at that point, I decided to go to the beginning of the collection called the New Testament. I started in Matthew 1. And literally within about, a half hour, I got to Matthew 5. And I read this piece. Jesus is giving what I recognize as a Devar Torah. which in Judaism you read from the Torah, one of the first 5 books. It's it's the main thing in Judaism, and the rabbi typically gives, when you read a portion of the Torah, the rabbi typically gives a Devar Torah, like an interpretation or explanation, a teaching on what you had just read. So Jesus is giving what I recognize as Devar Torah starting in Matthew 5, and goes on for a few chapters, or it's written. And I'm thinking, man, this is the most brilliant Devar Torah I'd ever read or heard. It came at it from a completely different perspective that wasn't really some of what he was dealing with is discussed in some of the debates that you see in the Talmud, but it was just something completely different. And what I had realized later on was I was reading the Sermon on the Mount. So anyway, really long story short, at that point, I just continued reading through the New Testament. By the time I got to Revelation 22, I was pretty sure that I was going to do this thing, whatever this thing was. And I called Hal. I'm like, all right, Hal, so if I'm going to do this like Christian thing, like, what's the prayer? And he goes, what do you mean, what's a prayer? I'm like, well, there's a prayer for the bread, for the wine, for the washing of the hands. What's the prayer for, like, the Jesus prayer? He goes, no, man, you just talk to God. I'm like, come on. No, there's got to be like a Baruch Atah Hashem. There's got to be like a prayer. He's like, no, just talk to God. Just like tell him what's on your heart. So 3 a.m, whether it was that night or the next night, I can't remember, but shortly thereafter, I talked to God, like stumbling over myself. God, I'm not sure if I need an appointment or, I was just like totally stumbling over myself, but I tried to have a conversation with God for the first time in a non-regimented way, and the next morning I looked at Miss Lisa, my lovely bride. We were married, how long? I think we were only about married for 2 or 3 years at that point. And I said, Lisa, I think I'm a Christian. And the first thing she says is, she's from the South. She says, if you think I'm going to church every Sunday, you got another thing coming. So she was not too happy about it. She later became a Christian, but she wasn't too happy about it. And then about a month after that was Thanksgiving. I had to go home and tell my family I became a Christian. So
yeah, let's put a pin on that real quick, so I can explore a couple other things that got brought up in there. Really curious on where were you with your faith at that time? Because it seems like Hal was pushing you to at least explore Christianity, if not maybe more so than that. Did he sense that you needed some guidance in the spirituality piece of your life? Or why do you think he was guiding you there and not, maybe sticking to entrepreneurship and fatherhood and some of the other things that you were directly seeking from him?
It's interesting that he pursued it because he knew that I was very, very teachable in all these other areas. But he also knew that to the extent that they were pushing Jesus on me or Christianity on me, my convictions as a Jew became much more deeply rooted. I dug my heels in. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, I got my beliefs. Like, don't force your beliefs on me. So I don't know. I think it was his evangelical impulse or maybe his evangelical training, but he was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Not to get too spiritual about it, but I think, or too mystical about it. But if you believe in God or you believe in sovereignty, I think God has a way of putting circumstances and people in your life, some of whom you're coming in contact with, some of whom are just praying for you, that all line up to either chip away at a heart of stone or ultimately sink you if you're fighting against that wave, if you're fighting against that tide. So I think that it's more that's what it was, that there were all kinds of things lining up to, and for me, looking back, it wasn't all that I had learned. It wasn't so much that I was abandoning my faith or abandoning my family, my filial obligation, everything that I had believed. To me, it was much more like I was evolving it, taking the next step. Certain things made more sense as a next chapter in the larger story. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think that does make a lot of sense. And I see that in your storyline. So to get back to Thanksgiving, I believe it was Thanksgiving either 2000 or 2001, about 20 years ago. We'll put it at that.
Yeah.
You decided you were going to become a Christian and you had to tell your parents about this. And I'm really interested what your feelings were going into that conversation, because I think I need to put some context here. There was more significance to this than just telling your parents, like, I no longer want to play baseball. Someone would have to understand that the history of Judaism in your family and some of the like immediate religious persecution that your family was not that far removed from. So what was the anticipation and feelings that were going through walking off the plane and getting ready to tell your parents that you're a born again Christian?
Yeah. I knew that there was anything that I could have told them, literally anything that I could have told them that would have been less difficult than this. I could have told them that, the first thing that came to, I could have told them that I'm gay. Mm-hmm. I could have told them that I'm a Buddhist. I could have told them that I'm a convicted felon. I could have told, I'm on drugs. I don't know. I could have told them anything and they would have received it with less animosity than this. That's what I was anticipating. And that did bear itself out in a lot of ways. So yeah, I knew that it wasn't going to be well received, but I thought that I had done, to say I had done my homework before I had made this decision is quite an understatement. So I thought I'd done enough homework to have substance behind it wasn't even a decision. It was more like a revelation, So I knew that I'd be able to have that conversation as long as they were willing to have it. I was also willing to be ostracized or disowned or whatever the consequences might be, because I knew that what I had believed was true. Mm-hmm. Not that I was right. It wasn't a matter of me being right. It was that it was true. And this was the next step for me. So I was willing to deal with whatever I had to deal with. And, my dad and I had one type of interaction. My mom and I had a very different interaction about it. So
let's go into those two. So you're right. Very, very polar opposites in this case. So I believe it was like a 2-hour conversation on your porch with your dad, correct?
Yeah. It was a long conversation. And we flew a red eye that night. So it was Thanksgiving morning. So I was pretty bleary eyed at that point. I was more nervous about flying because I'm just not a good flyer than I was about the conversation with my dad. And we ended up having a 2-hour conversation. He was a guidance counselor most of his career, a high school guidance counselor. So I anticipated that what kind of framework the conversation or feel the conversation would have. And it went that way. He was very analytical about it. He had questions. He wasn't confrontational yet. So I just spelled it out for him and answered every one of his questions. His more confrontational engagement came about a month later. The letter, their 10-page single-spaced letter spelling out all of the reasons why I can't become a Christian: emotional, spiritual, theological, philosophical, political, family, all these different things. That was the start of a conversation, of a much, much, much years-long conversation. Yeah. But that morning, after my dad, after like we were winding down a conversation, Ronnie, my dad goes, "You got to go in and tell your mother." So I'm like, all right. So I went in. I wasn't going to have another 2-hour conversation. That's just not the kind of relationship my mother and I have. So she was on the computer in her, and I just rolled out with it. I'm like, Mom, I don't know how to say it, so I'm just going to say it. I became a Christian. And Phyllis was typing, and it was almost like her hands kind of floated. They were still in the typing movements, and they floated, and she floated into the other room practically. And she was just sort of dazed. So I followed her into the other room. I'm like, Mom, I don't know if you heard me. I became a Christian. And the first thing she says is, "I'm sorry. I just never thought I'd have a son. And she didn't quite have the words. And the first, she goes, I never thought I'd have a son who was walking with Jesus. And then she yells into the other room. She goes, Ronnie, du hast, which is, it's a Yiddish for like, are you hearing this? Did you hear? Du hast? Our son is a born again Republican. So yeah, she had a very different reaction. It was, I think maybe somebody heard it and created a character on a sitcom about her. So I don't know. And she's more
that's hilarious.
Yeah. We've had a tense relationship on and off throughout my life. But when I remember that she really is kind of a sitcom-ish character, that's when things go a little bit better for us. Like she's funny. She doesn't mean to be, but she's freaking hilarious. So
that's awesome. So as you mentioned, your dad wrote you this 10-page single-spaced letter. What was the initial response to that? How did you reply to that letter?
I had to process it because there was so much to process. But after a while, I decided to take it paragraph by paragraph, if not sentence by sentence, and just respond one piece at a time. And when I started responding to one piece, I would get a response from him to that response, which I'd then have to respond to. So we had all these different threads going. And it was a solid 3 years. And it was tense. Those first 2 or 3 years was very, very tense. But it was helpful in a way because it forced me to really think things through. Some of the things that he said, I had to listen. Admittedly, I think I was going at it from a more contentious, albeit lovingly contentious. Mm-hmm. I was trying to be kind and gentle about it, but I had an agenda. I wanted to prove my point.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I was doing was looking for evidence or looking for backup of what my point of view was, as opposed to fully hearing what he was saying and having much more of an open dialogue about it. But as our conversation evolved and it became less about me winning an argument and more about the relationship, I think it became much more rich and nuanced. Yeah. So, and he was doing the same thing too. I think he was trying to win a debate or, convince me to just wave off this whole Christian thing. So, but over time it became much more about enriching the relationship, deepening each other's knowledge and understanding of philosophy and theology and how we might answer important questions. And the interesting thing is we started out at so far apart on really important things. And once we prioritized the relationship as opposed to winning a debate, we realized how much closer together we were on really important things. Just to give you one example, his view of Jesus when we first started out can be summed up by a treatise he sent me by kind of an obnoxious Jewish scholar or rabbi, I guess you would call him. And the treatise was entitled, "You Take Jesus, I'll Take God." It was so dismissive and so snarky in a uniquely sort of Jewish scholarly way. But his view of Jesus had evolved over the years to where I think he would say now, obviously this is decades later, but he would say now that Jesus was what might be referred to as a tzaddik, like a great rabbi of his generation. He would even say that Jesus should have been a Jewish prophet in the tradition of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, like a legitimate Jewish prophet. And he even says that, very nuanced, he even says that Jesus was a Messiah candidate. But here's the thing. He says he was a failed Messiah candidate, but the failure wasn't his. It was the people of Israel. So that's really specific, really nuanced. If you're interested in this kind of thing, it's like, oh wow, that's it. That's real. Like obviously a Christian would say, no, he was Messiah and Son of God and all that stuff. But I think going from "You take Jesus, I'll take God" to that answer, the Jesus as Messiah candidate and the failure wasn't his. That's an interesting, nuanced perspective that I have to respect,
No doubt. And it's really interesting to see how that conversation developed. It really got to a place, and you were telling me this, that you guys realized what you both thought was true had more similarities than differences. And there might be some small nuances in your guys' thoughts, but ultimately you believe in so much of the same thing. And I think the conversation really turned that direction because your dad and I'm guessing you prioritized the relationship and woke up one day and realized my relationship with my son is more important than the faith that my son observes. Is that correct?
I think that's fair to say. I think he saw that as maybe not tertiary, maybe isn't the right way to put it, but there were other things that were more important than where I worshiped, Frankly, I think there were other aspects of our Christian community where we were going to church that he objected to more, even more than the Jesus thing.
What do you mean?
As he was evolving his view of Jesus, he was also seeing certain things about the Christian community that I was a part of that were more objectionable. Specifically, and if you fast forward now into 2016 and 2020, what the American evangelical community has become, there were the seeds of that, the roots of that you could see as early as 2004, 2006, 2008. I'm marking it by like election years because that's the easiest way to think of it. But there were people in my that I went to church with that believed things that just didn't line up with what the Bible was saying. And it really, and my kids were going to a Christian school, and there were flashpoints. There were moments when this became much more obvious. I went to a worship service, and the pastor was teaching on, it was just overtly speaking on immigration, and he was using a chapter from Leviticus to make his anti-immigration point. And I'm like, dude, you haven't read this chapter. He was using a piece of a verse from the top of the chapter in order to make an anti-immigration political statement. But if you ever read the end of the chapter, it's basically, the Bible saying, if y'all really do have a policy position, it should be an open border policy, So I'm not necessarily fully open borders, but that's what that chapter was. And there were a lot of things just like that were explicitly instances when well-meaning, well-intentioned Christian friends of mine were putting their preferences, their social or political preferences first, and backing scripture into it. And when scripture didn't line up with it, it was being dismissed. And I think my dad saw some of that because he'd meet a bunch of friends from church, some of whom he's still really, really good friends with, but others he just couldn't take very seriously and found a level of hypocrisy there. So, but that's a whole other, other conversation, I guess.
I'm kind of curious. How do you create the separation in your mind on that topic in particular? How do you make sure so much of what you're saying and these preferences, particularly political preferences, aren't supported by the scriptures. And yet these are still people that have these ideas that are part of your spiritual community. Is there a way you rectify that in your head? Does that make sense?
It does. Well, first of all, if we look at the Bible as a record of history or some sort of, I don't take the Bible literally as some might put it. Mm-hmm. I try to take the Bible, I think it is authoritative. It is my primary authority. But there are books in the Bible that aren't meant to be taken, quote unquote, literally. Like the Song of Songs, it's meant to be taken as poetry. There are others that are a little bit closer to what we would think of as history, but they didn't have the academy, all of the universities to define this is good history and this is how you write history and this is how you do history. So they weren't, even the histories, Kings and Chronicles, they weren't abiding by the same rules that we would. So you have to take it in its context. Who were the folks who were writing it down, to whom they were writing it for? But all that to say, if you look at the prophets in the Bible, they were more often than not talking to the people of God, or as we would think of it, the church or the people of Israel. They were talking to the people of their community, of their faith and family. And they weren't so much talking to Babylon. They weren't so much talking to Persia. They were talking more often than not among themselves. So, and why did Isaiah feel a need to speak to the people of Israel? Why did Jesus feel a need to talk to Jews? His primary audience were the Jews. Why was that necessary? Because again and again and again, from the very moment in the story where, the Jews were rescued from Egypt and they heard the voice of God and they saw all these miracles, they were stumbling and falling all over themselves again and again and again. So they needed to be spoken to. They needed to have prophets. So the idea that the church, in particular the American church, or even more broadly speaking, anybody who might identify as a Christian nowadays, the idea that we're somehow off base, it's not like we're completely sanctified. We're all human beings. So I think that we need to have prophets from within the church. I think we need to have truth tellers from within the church. Hey, you might not be worshiping a golden calf, or in some cases they actually are, or a golden trump, but you are, thou shalt have no other gods before me. This is what you're putting before God. This is what you're putting before the word of God. And we, I kind of half jokingly say it about the golden trump, but you can turn to almost any page in the Bible and it testifies against the words, actions, and character of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that we're elevating this person as a leader, as even trying to rationalize and saying he's more like one of the kings from the histories that isn't a Christian, but he's helping the Christian. I'm like, what are you doing? The mental gymnastics that it takes for you to see that, just starting with like, what is good? What are virtues? What's the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. These things Donald Trump has none of. What is good? Love is good. What's the one of the few imperatives to that we love one another. And what is love? Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. A guy like Donald Trump is on the wrong end of all of that stuff. So the idea that we're elevating him as someone who will fight for us, and that's how we're justifying it. No. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. You just put something before God, before God's word, right? So I think that we need prophets from, not that I'm a prophet, not that I'm,
sure.
I don't have any sort of special anointing, but I do think, to be fair, I do think that the idiots and the assholes get a lot more press. I also think it's fair to say that, like, look, something as wide ranging that includes as many American Christians as the Southern Baptist Convention corporately has it really, really wrong. But, we can look to the Beth Moores and the Russell Moores and the David Frenches and the people within that are more explicitly religious leaders, as well as people that are in culture that are taking arrows left and right, that are ostracized, that are canceled, if you will, because I think they are true to their faith and their theology, but they also see where some of those discrepancies are and are willing to pay the price for those convictions. So yeah. I don't think it's a simple answer, but that's the best I can give you.
Yeah, no, it was a tough question. But you brought up discrepancies and you mentioned this word nuance in your podcast intro. And I would love to move the conversation towards that and really exploring nuance. So at one point in your life, you were both a stockbroker by day and a theater guy by night.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess those environments created somewhat of a political dichotomy. How did spending time with each of these groups shape your political ideologies? And did it give you a sense of empathy and understanding for nuance?
I always dug both. And I dug being a part of, as well as a little bit different from both of those communities. And going forward into this day, I have my church friends, but one of my main businesses I've had since 99 is an entertainment focused business. So my entertainment friends are very, very different than my church friends and vice versa. But back then, I knew that I was the only guy showing up for the class or the workshop or the rehearsal with my white button down collar, with my hair slicked back still from the day. I was also the only one, if you'll excuse me being blunt, but I was one of the few guys that wasn't going out for hookers and blow at night.
Yeah.
From Wall Street. I was going to a theater. But I felt that I had good friends who kind of dug that, guys on Wall Street who kind of dug that I was going to a theater, and, people that I was going to the theater with that dug that, I had a suit and tie on during the day. My teacher referred to me. There was this movie that Oliver Stone made called Wall Street, and he called me Bud Fox. Hey, look, he was an Italian. Bud Fox, say, what the fuck are you doing? What is this? The Bud Fox. You're playing a character? What are you doing? Sell me some stock, motherfucker. That's what, sorry, I'm cursing now. That's it.
Go ahead.
But that's what is this? You're doing some acting? My cigarette does better acting than you. My God, Bud fucking Fox.
I love this. Did those two separate groups, or the groups that you have today, mingle? Did you bring them together? And if so, I would love to understand some of the behaviors of the ones that got along the best versus the ones that didn't get along very well.
Well, I can tell you more about later in my life, in my adult life, because the worlds of the entertainment industry and American evangelicalism are much further apart. And I would have either intense aversion to the others. For example, I remember I went to a poker game. So by the way, I'm a Christian. I believe Jesus lived, died, and rose again. I believe in the Bible. I believe all that stuff. But I'm a Christian who curses, plays poker, and I drink. So it is. I don't find any inconsistency there, truly. And we can talk about that. But that's But I was at this poker game. It was entertainment, mostly entertainment industry friends. And it was a Saturday night. Comes to about midnight, 12:30. I'm like, guys, I got to wake up early. We're going to church tomorrow morning. So I'm going to cash in and call it a night. And I couldn't leave because this gal sitting next to me was just giving me the business. She's like, why do you people block, I'm like, first of all, you lost me at you people. Like, she's just like, is that, I just, my hackles went up and I was just like, why do you people? And I think it might've been late 2015, 2016, but it was already clear that Donald Trump was emerging as a serious candidate. And not only that a lot of Christians were embracing him. Why do all you people, how can you people this and that about Donald Trump? I'm like, first of all, you lost me at you people, but second of all, he's not my guy. Like he's not my guy. So I don't feel any need to defend that which I do not believe. I have no compulsion or feelings that I need to explain this to you, because you're starting from a place of prejudice, and it wasn't to say it wasn't a productive conversation is an understatement, because it wasn't entered into in good faith. It wasn't entered into in an intellectually honest way. And because she came in with her dukes up, I didn't display the nonviolent resistance that Jesus or Dr. King or even Mahatma Gandhi would advocate, but I did. That was a common refrain that I found myself being asked or forced to defend something that I just didn't believe based on these perceptions that were way off base. Mm-hmm. And listen, some of them, as I just described, it went on a screed about, Trump and how the Bible can testify against him. It's fair. so I think the best I got, the best that came out of that was like, look, I understand why you feel that way. And I feel largely the same way. But here's what I found, that to start off with generalizations, mischaracterizations, and demonizations, vilifications, is just not, we're not going to make things better if that's the terrain that we're fighting on. I don't know if she heard me, but at the very least, we were able to have conversations in the future. I was able to be in the same room with her again in the future without feeling like she wanted to strangle me. But there were other conversations I've had, like in 2000, I think it was 4, maybe 2006. It was Prop 8 was a big thing here in California. It was the gay marriage bill. And frankly, I had come to an evolution. My thinking evolved on that, because even though I was still grappling with the theology on it, and there are certain things that are pretty hard to get around what the Bible says about homosexuality, at the very least, I had come to the conclusion that, like, listen, I got to figure out what the Bible's really saying and what the context is. I don't know, because I know a lot of my friends from church think this is the end of civilization as we know it. If two people who love each other get married and, that they think that's the end of civilization. I thought that, listen, I happen to believe in the Bible, so I got to work that out for myself. But my friend who wants to marry somebody he loves doesn't believe in the Bible. And we live in America. We live in a pluralistic society. So at the very least, like, what I do know is if we pass this Prop 8 thing and it's illegal for gay people to get married, I do know for a fact that every friend that I have that's gay that might want to think about getting married legally, if we pass this, they're not going to wake up and say, oh, it's illegal to get married. Oh, it must be wrong to be gay. Oh, and if it's wrong to be gay, I better become a Christian. Like, this was just the dumbest thing that I had ever, like, it didn't make sense to me. So to have these conversations, and as I was arriving at these sorts of conclusions, I was able to have the most productive conversations, and one in particular, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's gay. And he really challenged me. He said, well, what does it say in the Bible? I said, well, let's look, let's open it up. And two parts in particular. One was Titus. One was, I want to say 1 Timothy. It might have been, I want to say 1 Timothy. Might be 2 Timothy. Anyway, it's like this list of the writer of the letter is listing this behavior or evidence of a fallen world, right? And a lot of translations include in both of those lists homosexuality. Later on, I started learning a little bit of the language, and I found that sexual immorality is probably a better way to describe it. But as I understood it back then, homosexuality. But in both of these lists, I'm reading them. I'm like, oh man, I'm guilty of this one, that one, that one. Mm-hmm. And I came to the conclusion with my buddy that I was talking to. I'm like, first of all, it was cool that he allowed me to open up the Bible and actually read scripture with me. That was cool. He was indulging me, but it was cool that we could have it. We could find some common ground. And even if he just looked at it as literature, ancient from antiquity or whatever, it was cool that he was indulging me on that level. But also I was realizing that, holy cow, like I'm guilty ways than you are. I know he's a really good guy. So, that was an interesting conclusion that I arrived at. That like, even if it does say this about homosexuality, I got some things to work on, man. You're a better man than me, So that's a productive conversation,
I love that you got that to that conclusion too. And you actually did a really great job showcasing what you shouldn't do. You people, I think is one maybe great flag or, caution out there that you might be going down the wrong path if that word comes up or that phrase comes up. And then also this curiosity and exploring that your friend asked and kind of indulged on you with, and you came to the similarities. So I would love to dive into a little bit more of a personal story. Your middle child made the decision to stay unvaccinated. I would love for you to explain that decision-making process. And I'm actually really curious what you learned by watching your son go through that decision process.
Well, the biggest thing I learned is that I went about it in the wrong way, especially in the beginning. And in particular, what was easy for me to do, it was a trap that I fell into, is I thought that deploying shame and harassment, if you stood on solid moral ground, were effective tactics that would persuade someone. If you are right, if you are morally correct, then you can deploy all kinds of emotional, moral, intellectual weaponry, and that is all going to be effective in winning this person over. And that's just not the case, especially with certain people. Different people respond to different things, so understanding them. But more often than not, like with my son, what happened was the truth is he was on the fence about the possibility of taking the vaccine early on when they were first being rolled out. But his initial stance was, I'm not going to take it early, partly because I feel like I'm young and I'm not really prone to getting really sick, but also because these things were developed really fast. So that's what he was saying. I wasn't necessarily hearing it. I was just hearing, and everybody around him was hearing that he hadn't gotten vaccinated yet. So he was actually open to it, but he got to a place where he's like, at the very least, I want to wait for FDA approval. But by the time the FDA approval had happened, so many people close to him in our family were downright abusive towards him, made him feel dumb and irresponsible and wrong and evil. All these things shamed him and harassed him to the point where he's like, fuck all of you. Like, now I understand a lot of folks might hear that response that my son had to the shaming and stuff, be like, well, that's immature. Yeah, if you do, doing the right thing is still doing the right thing, regardless of whether somebody, makes fun of you for it. So it wasn't necessarily perhaps the most mature reaction, but you have to admit it's an understandable one. Mm-hmm. That the thing that became the focus for him was the combat, was people treating him in such a way that was flatly unkind. And it didn't give him the benefit of thinking clearly about the actual issue itself. What it became was thinking about his adversary in this battle and defending himself and his own honor and his own sense of right and wrong and who he was as a person, a good or bad person. That became the focus. So I let it lie. I made a case, I think right around July 4th. Yeah, it was right around July 4th because I had a similar conversation. It wasn't nearly as adversarial because he's a friend, but he wasn't terribly close to me. So he said, yeah, he's kind of not old, but older than me. So I guess that's old. Anyway, he said, we saw each other for the first time in about a year because of all the, lockdowns and everything. So it was great to see everybody, and vaccines came up. It was right the week before July 4th. And he said, yeah, I'm not going to get it because listen, if I get the Rona, I got a 99% chance of getting through it, and then I'll be immune and then it'll be all good. So he's like, I like my chances, and I don't really buy into all this stuff anyway. I'm like, yeah, okay. And in a group of like however many people, 8 or 10 or 12 people, it wasn't really a conversation that we were going to be able to dive deep into, So meanwhile, his wife, less than a week later, his wife calls. We have this group text for a group of friends of ours. And she says, he's sick and he won't go to the hospital. Like, oh boy, here we go. And we were all concerned too, because we were all in the same room together less than a week prior. And a day or so after that, it was a Thursday. She said, could some of you guys text him and tell him to at least go to emergency room or something? So finally, by Friday, he went to the hospital, but they brought him directly into critical, what do they call it? The critical care thing?
Yeah.
Saturday, he was on a ventilator, and literally Sunday, he died.
Wow.
So that's when I had the last conversation with Jackie Boy, the older of my two boys. I have 3 kids, a daughter and 2 sons. And I said, listen, this is what happened, Jack. And I just want you to listen to me. And I promise, I know where your head's at and your heart's at right now. So I promise I'm going to say what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to leave you alone about it. So I told him what happened with my friend. And subsequently, I had 2 other friends. Once Delta was like really raging, I had 2 other friends, same thing, anti-vax, all 3 actually pro-Trump as well, not so coincidentally. But I lost 3 friends, and one actually was earlier on. But anyway, I let it lie. And then a few months after that, FDA approval, I think that was in August or maybe September, finally got the FDA approval. So I said, Jack, can we talk about this again? And he at that time, things had settled down a bit, at least emotionally. They weren't as heated. So we could have a conversation about it. And I had come to some understanding of how I had personally dealt with it. I was part of, the dog pile and the rabbit kind of a thing. And I just think that was a mistake. And at least, and the way I approached him this time wasn't necessarily, I care about the kids. So obviously, I believe that the vaccines are effective. So I want him to get a vaccine. And I believe not only that it's the right thing to do because, if he's going to be around my parents, elderly, immunocompromised, whatever, he owes that to them. So I would love for him to get the vaccine. And it arose just recently, my 3 best friends, our whole families got together over the holidays, and he was the only one that wasn't vaccinated. But there are other ways that we dealt with it. Anyway, the conversation was, help me understand. My question to him, help me understand. And that's when I understood his thought process and his decision-making process. I didn't agree with it all. I didn't agree with his response, but I understood it better. And merely by understanding it better, as opposed to approaching it from an immediately adversarial point of view, I was able to get back into the conversation with him, and I was able to redeem that strain of the relationship. And I think that's really important. It gives you a fighting chance, and I think he knows that it's not to say that I'll never take a really firm ground or really, sometimes if I have to be combative or even have an inkling of combativeness on something, he knows that it will be worth it, that I'll be picking my spots on that, and yeah, so I think I earned his trust, whether it might not be in the vaccine issue, because I might have lost, not credibility with him, but I lost my right in a way to have that level of credibility with him on this particular issue. But there may be other issues that going forward, I will have some buy-in from him.
Sure.
So I don't know if any of this is making sense.
No, I think
again, talk about nuance.
That's a perfect story to illustrate something I was trying to demonstrate. And your son was essentially ostracized by the adversaries and had to turn around, and there's only one place he could really turn, and there's his allies, arms wide open, and so many people that aren't vaccinated, and they get the opportunity to continue to explore that line of thinking with him, while I'm just going to make it polar, the other side really lost their opportunity to convince him or to share some insight or wisdom around it. And I think so often we do that, especially in the topics of politics and religion. And it's really challenging, but I commend you for how you mended the relationship. I would love to explore that a little bit more. Obviously, this last 1.5, 2 years has created separations inside of families and friendships. If we have somebody in mind, we're listening right now, and we have somebody in mind that we'd love to mend a relationship with, what do you think would be a good way to approach that?
That's a big question. So there are a couple of phrases that come to mind, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I use the phrase with my son, help me understand. A business partner of mine does that sometimes, and we make fun of him for it. Like, Donkey's going all help me understand on us. Look out.
It's such a good phrase, though, I think. It is really, really good wording.
Yeah. Because if you're sincere about it, then you can get inside of their thinking, right?
Sure. You have to be careful about the tone and the messaging you're sharing. I mean, using specific words and phrases is one half of that equation, but the way you deliver it and the intent behind you delivering it too is honestly the more important half.
Yeah, because it's a diagnosis, really. First of all, it'll open up your own understanding, and you'll often find that whatever the point of tension isn't what you thought it was. So it really is helpful. You learn something. It helps you diagnose. So if you go into it saying, help me understand why the hell you blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
that's not
exactly.
Really, that's still,
why you people.
Yeah, why you people. So that's not really helpful, but help me understand is more of a human connection point. And you get to have, you get to kind of go into a little bit more of the detail of what they're thinking. And there might be aspects that don't need to be dealt with. There might be aspects that you won't be able to find common ground, but there might be other pieces of this where you can find some common ground, and that's the other. So help me understand. And two is most often you are not going to be able to change someone's mind by 180 degrees. They're not going to go from someone who's voted Republican their entire lives to somebody who's voted Democrat for the rest of their, or vice versa. You're not going to be able to go from vax to anti-vax in one conversation on any particular issue or a whole worldview. But you can often have 1 degree of influence. You can often help someone open their understanding or come to a new conclusion by one step, right? But the thing is, when that's done effectively, it almost requires you as the other person in the dialogue to be open to the possibility of adding 1 degree of nuance to your own point of view. So I think a lot of folks get frustrated because I have really good friends and I feel for them because all they see, like they'll turn on the news for 5 minutes, they'll get frustrated. Oh, things are going to crap and I can't do anything about it. And the world's of this and the world. No, you can't change the world in a day or even a presidential term. You can't. You can't. And to what I'm saying, you can't even change one person's point of view 180 degrees. But you could have 1 point of human connection with one person and maybe have 1 degree of influence on them. And that's changing the world, right? Mm-hmm. And one other phrase I'll give on this topic, and it helps you get there. So help me understand. And somebody gave me one. It was actually a friend of Hal's that gave me this a long time ago. It might be like a Dale Carnegie thing. And again, I don't mean to make it sound simple or cheesy or anything like that, but feel, felt, found is really helpful. Once you get into help me understand, and you do find one of those things that you don't have to deal with and he's not going to move on, but maybe one of those things that there is some movability on. Oh, I never thought of it that way. I understand why you'd feel. I understand why you feel that way. Like with my son, he's when he described getting attacked and bullied and harassed. Wow, I can totally understand why you'd feel that way. I would have felt the same way if I was, and I have felt the same way when I've been in that position. And then here's what I found, So I understand how you feel. I would have felt and have felt the same way in similar situations. Here's what I found, so help me understand, feel, felt, found. It's a really, I don't know, it's more relational. It's not transactional, it's relational. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
No doubt. I think that was a really good prescriptive method there. And really, really helps me in that sense as well. Corey, as we're concluding this conversation, I have one more thing on this topic that I want to cover, and that's respectfully disagreeing. Because there's got to be moments when you don't agree and you need to stand up for your beliefs. What actionable advice do you have around that topic in particular?
Oh man, I might have a completely different answer if you ask me tomorrow, let alone next month or next year. But
maybe how you're feeling at the moment too.
Well, yeah. What immediately came to mind again is another major failure on my part. I remember moments with my daughter, who's 20 now, when my disposition in my encounter with her was, well, you're wrong, so that's the truth, that you're wrong, and it just didn't go well. As opposed to, there are some things that, to your point, that are worth fighting for. If someone is self-destructively abusing drugs or alcohol or something, that's fight for the ones you love, their lives, fight for their lives, right? So there are some of those, but man, so many things that we think we need to fight for, but we really don't, and I'd rather have you at my table than have you apart from us and forming this caricature of what we think of you and what you think of us. And it's not going to go anywhere, but maintaining that point of connection and accepting someone's peculiarities, if you want to think of it that way. Oh, this person voted for Trump. Oh, well, he that's one of his peculiarities. Now, listen, there are certain things that I do have a harder time for. If I know a lot of people that I love and respect that voted for Trump at least once, if not twice. I do have a harder time with the whole Stop the Steal. I do have a harder time with people who are pretending that the insurrection didn't happen, that it was a nothing burger, that they were let in and they were peaceful. Like, I have a hard time with that. So I do have my limitations when it comes to this stuff in the political realm. But I think there aren't as many categorical plant your flag, protect this ground things that we think. So why don't we just hang out and have a glass of wine? Why don't we talk about the Mets?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I'd love to get the conversation, and obviously, political and religious conversations have maybe more to lose or more impact. But if we could discuss some of these topics inside of those, like we would discuss a healthy sports rivalry, maybe not Yankees Red Sox, but Mets Cardinals, we can sit there and debate and have good fun and poke at each other. But at the end of the day, we can sit across together, we can have a good meal, we can have a laugh, and we can talk about something else as well. And it's not impacting our overall relationship. I'd love to get there with our political conversations as well.
Because there's other work that we can do together, other good work that we can do together. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan really disagreed on tax policy, really disagreed on foreign policy, really disagreed on just about everything. But they got really good work done together. Mm-hmm. And it required different points of view to find, I think it was, 80%, getting 80% of what I want isn't getting 0% of it. I forget how Reagan put it, but it was basically like, I can get a lot of what I want here, and compromise is not failure. Compromise is not losing the war. Sometimes we shouldn't even think of it that way. Sometimes it's collaboration. More often than not, if you're open to it, it's actual collaboration. So I don't know if you're going to get the inglorious MTG in the same room with AOC. Like, I just don't know. But you can certainly get Kinzinger and Cheney in the room with AOC. They're not going to find a lot of common ground, but they can get in the room. They can definitely get Cheney and Kinzinger can definitely get in the room with Spamberger for sure. So I think there's a lot more overlap here if we allow those voices to be the more prominent ones. If it's all battle, if it's all, well, he's my enemy and there is no common ground with my enemy, I don't know. I can't do any business with you. But if you disagree with me on, I'm not a big fan of minimum wage, just throwing one thing out there. as a small business owner, because I can take better care of the people that are on our team than what is prescripted by folks who've never balanced a checkbook, let alone a P&L. But that's a whole other conversation. But I'm sure that what I do know, having gone before the LA County Board of Supervisors to talk about this, is that we share common goals. So if we share common goals about people having a healthy livelihood, about folks being able to, live in LA County with the opportunities that we're creating in our company, I agree with all this stuff. So finding our way there, that's, let's stay in that conversation as opposed to thinking that, oh, he's against minimum $15 minimum wage. He's the enemy. You can't be in the room. We have to throw rocks at you. You're a terrible person. What are you, anti-vax? All you people, So.
Corey, this has been an awesome conversation. I'm trying to bite my tongue right now to not ask a follow-up question because I already see we're over the hour mark here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's been such a blast. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up conversation, especially if this spurs some further debate. But if people want to explore a little bit more about you and dive into this topic a little bit more, you got an awesome podcast. Why don't you tell the listeners about your podcast and where they can find it?
Thank you so much. It's called Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. And the talking is an apostrophe and killing is an apostrophe. So talking politics and religion without killing each other. We're on all the apps, Apple and Spotify and all that. We do have a website, politicsandreligion.podbean.com. Politics and all spelled out, politicsandreligion.podbean.com. And all the socials, we're at TP&R pod, at TP&R pod on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff. So,
yep. Yeah. And if you didn't catch that, just open up the show notes right now, scroll down, you'll see more of Corey, and you can click on any of those links there. Corey, my final question for you. If you had the opportunity to teach a 16-week class to a group of graduating college seniors on a topic that isn't normally covered in the classroom, what would you teach and how would you teach it?
Okay. So the short answer is the class would be how to get your first gig and then how to thrive and build your career once you land that gig.
Tell me more.
Oh, okay. You want me to tell you more? Okay. So I think that first of all, it's not often covered in colleges, and the advice that kids are getting in whether it's a local community college or a big expensive university isn't great advice. It's not. So first of all, the ways to get that gig is it actually does tie into some of the things that we're talking about. It's by taking inventory of your circle of influence. Even if you're a college student, if you really start to take account of who you know and who you've met along the way, whether it's a professor or someone who came in to give a special lecture or someone you encountered at an event or something, you know a lot of people. So take inventory of your own circle of influence. And then by doing so and accounting for that, whether it's through tools like LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever, Instagram and Twitter, you know a lot of people. And then reach out to those folks in a relational and not a transactional way. So again, it does kind of rhyme with some of the themes that we were talking about. What I mean by that is if somebody's doing cool work in an industry that you're interested in and they seem like a cool person, then hit them up. And be like, hey, you came to my class and I was really intrigued by what you said. I looked into some of your work and wow, that invention was awesome or whatever. Like just say something nice without totally kissing their ass. Tell them a little bit about who you are. It's the outreach is broken down into 3 parts. Why are you reaching out? Like what's cool about them without kissing their ass? Who are you in, 1 or 2 sentences max? And then what do you want? But what you want is, hey, give me a gig, give me a project, give me work, give me money. No, don't do that. Avoid that altogether because that's transactional. What's relational is I would love to buy you a cup of coffee. I just want to pick your brain. You're who I want to be in 20 years, something like that. I would love to pick your brain. Can I buy you lunch? Can I buy you coffee? Can we hop on a Zoom one day? Just what you're closing for. So you say something nice, you tell them who you are, and then you close. But what you're closing for is the beginning of a relationship. A relationship is like a ladder. It's like you take one step up the first rung. That's the first rung, and I think what you'll find is that you'll get a much higher response than putting your resume on a job board. It's just a resume. It's just a transaction in that instance. But if you are hitting up people you know, and then eventually your secondary circle of influence in this way, whether it's on IM on Twitter or an email or whatever, there are so many different ways to reach out to people. I think you'll have a much higher percentage. Not to say everybody's going to get back to you, but I think, to have 10 or 20% of the people that you reach out to in that regard is from what I've seen and how I've counseled folks over the years, it's a much higher percentage than that. So hope that helps.
No, I think that's extraordinary. I think that'd be a very valuable class. I think that approach is the right approach as well. And people are typically looking for a shortcut, and that seems like such like a long play. But I think people would also be surprised how quickly some relationships can develop as well. I mean, you and I were introduced through a mutual friend as well. And here you are on the podcast, and I did my due diligence in making sure that I would deliver some questions, and I made sure that you knew that I was serious about this, and hopefully we continue to build that relationship. So at any point in time, I could reach out and be like, hey, Corey, could you provide any support or help around this area? You can continue to do that. And, if you just have these coffees or these lunches or even these Zooms, sometimes you'll offer to pay and they won't even, they don't care about that. They're like, okay, starving college kid, don't worry. I like the intent. I really appreciate that. Let's do coffee. It's on me though. Like I've had just so many amazing mentors, especially early on in my career. And I can tell as maybe you're shifting from mentee to mentor too, and wanting to give back. This is something you're really passionate about, and you're speaking from like how some of the people that have reached out to you do it best. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. And man, it's been such a blast getting to know you and having you on the podcast.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation, Justin. It's you've made me think a lot and recount a lot. So it's been refreshing, and I just appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP&R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us, by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.